what's kind of underpinning what you're saying here is the question of why, right?
Yeah.
What's the point of why are we doing this? How does someone who's in law enforcement for decades, right? Not, as a prosecutor for 5 years, I'm no longer there. I think I can speak to a lot of the mentality that was there, but to the extent you're kind of thinking about why are they doing this? Why are they still waging this war if it hasn't been won, right? That's kind of what we're getting at here. And I think that part of it is that that's just not the question that they're asking themselves, right? It's not, if that was the question they asked themselves every day, there would be no way to survive in any job, right? No matter what your job is, whether it's drugs, whether you're a fisherman, whatever, pick any normal thing. If you're asking yourself every day by acknowledging, I'm not accomplishing the thing, I didn't accomplish yesterday what we set out to accomplish, and we're never going to accomplish it. You just wouldn't be able to move on. I think you're looking at kind of a smaller piece of it or just a totally different mentality, meaning you're going after bad guys, right? And so if at the end of the day you're making an arrest, whether you're taking drugs off the street, something you can point to, right? Something that's tangible. Even if that's not winning the war on drugs, it's something, and there will always be another case, right? Because you're not going to win the war on drugs. So that's not, I'm not saying that was my mentality, but just to kind of offer probably a way of thinking about it. If you're asking, how could someone do this every day, right? I think they're just not asking themselves the question of how are we going to win the war on drugs today? I think it's much more mundane. Like, I have this case in front of me. What do I need to do to complete this investigation, to get this particular load of drugs off the street, to prosecute this case? And so they're just not grappling with those bigger questions. Certainly not the people, I think, who are line prosecutors who are there every day. It's not that you don't think about it, but it's just not going to be your animating principle, I don't think, because it can't be, right? Because you're not actually winning that war, if that's the way that you conceive of it.
Yeah, I mean, it must just be some sort of, at some level, there's got to be some sort of like diffusion of responsibility, I guess, right? When everyone else you're working with and you're surrounded with is doing the same thing and, it's a good business, you guys, I guess they can justify it in their own way, like putting away bad guys, even though these bad guys are, they may not be the ones in charge calling all the shots. There's still some sort of even if you can prosecute somebody who is essentially just trying to feed their family by moving drugs, it looks good if you paint it the right way.
Sure, but to take it even a step further, sometimes we were getting the person who was calling the shots, right? And so that's a different story on the kind of bad guy level, right? The example you mentioned of someone who's kind of put in a tough position and is not a kingpin, they're not making a lot of money, that's easy to look at and say there's something wrong there, right? It should be handled differently, whether it means a person doesn't have any sort of culpability, but, someone shouldn't be spending the rest of their life in prison for the situation you describe, as I understand it. But we did sometimes get the people who were the kind of person you allude to, who is maybe the person who was effectively putting that lower level person in that situation, right? And so that raises a different sort of question. Now, I don't think that still answers the question. It doesn't justify the war, right? It's just a different consideration. I think it makes it easier to keep going if every day, at least the goal is to get that real bad guy, and there's a possibility of doing it. I think that answers the question of what is the motivation behind the people doing it, aside from the motivation being, okay, this is going to end the drug war.
Right. I'm sure you're familiar with the guy named El Mayo.
I know the name, yeah.
He's like the biggest guy. He started the Sinaloa cartel. It's just like fascinating to me how people like that are just like living in luxury in Mexico, like secluded. They stay off the papers, they have the media, and all you hear about is like people like El Chapo's kids. And
right. It's
just like the media frenzy around them. But you have like the big old rich guy who's basically like started everything, who's essentially immune to, I don't know how much DEA presence is in Mexico, or like how much of like American undercover officers or agents are down there working on this stuff still, but it's just always something that's really baffled me, especially when you see people like El Mayo that are just still out there living freely.
Right, but that's kind of an example of, if you're in the DEA, you look at kind of situation that described and say, okay, that's who we should be going after, right? As opposed to saying, we should just get out of this business because we're not solving anything, right? So it's kind of two different ways to look at it. And I'm not even saying that that's the way I look at it. And that it's just kind of another perspective if you're beating your head against the wall and saying, how is this possibly going on? And that doesn't justify it, but I think it does explain it in a real way.
And then the other dimension of this is the fact that if you did take out somebody like that, it would just be a power vacuum, right? Somebody would replace them instantly.
Well, right, because no matter whatever person around the world dies, that's not going to change the fact that people sitting here in the United States and throughout the world are always going to want to change their consciousness, right? And so as long as there's prohibition, there's going to be a way that that's made more dangerous to accomplish. And so whether it's a Mexican drug lord, whether it's a pharmaceutical company, whether it's anybody, these are just people who are filling that vacuum, filling that need of the fact that people will always want to change their consciousness. And that's not something that could ever be defeated. It's just, what do you do in the face of that reality?
And that's something that you and Hamilton talked about briefly in your podcast too, is he brought up the fact that, he brought up the question, why haven't we learned our lesson from alcohol prohibition? You know what I mean? Like we regulated alcohol. We were able to get rid of all the organized crime that was surrounding it and all of that stuff. Like, how come we haven't learned that lesson with some of these other drugs that are out there?
Well, it's cultural, right? I mean, it's not an unusual situation if you have someone in law enforcement, DEA, local or otherwise, goes out and makes a drug arrest, right? Then goes home and cracks open a Budweiser, right? And there's maybe at the time of Prohibition that would have been looked at in a different light. But I think it's the culture that we're in. What are you even talking about when you say a drug, right? If it's kind of a weird question. You're like, wait, what are you asking me, Jordan? But if I were to ask you, when you say drug, what are you talking about? Eventually, you would probably settle on a definition that's provided to you by the government and what's been made illegal, right? Something like that. You wouldn't think that alcohol is a drug, but these are cultural things that we have imbued within us that are handed down by the law. And so this sort of legal culture where you can be a cop who's making a drug arrest during the day, cracking open 15 Budweisers at night, the next day going back and doing the same thing all over again. One is a drug that's going to land that person in prison. The other is something that helps you take the edge off after a long day. The thing that's taking the edge off after a long day might well be more dangerous than whatever that drug is that you arrested someone for. But I think it's a cultural thing where someone could listen to what I just said and say, well, come on, right? Come on. There's no real argument behind it, but there is kind of a come on to it where there isn't an appetite to really change that for a lot of people, and that's why it doesn't change.
Right.